It was the way you put this round the back here, Ken, that didn't help. There we are.
Oh, right, okay. Right, okay, let's kick off.
Shall we see what we can do?
Right, okay. Right, well, welcome and thank you for being patient while you're waiting. Let's start off immediately with confession, insofar as some of you will probably know, in academic circles, the whole phrase, the Dark Ages, is now a bit in for a dig and not the way it's normally referred to. Having said that, the hassles I feel I've had researching the thing, I think I was quite justified in retaining the term the Dark Ages. And the reasons are fairly comprehensive, which I'll go into shortly. But basically, we're talking about the period from when the Romans left to the Battle of Hastings, two key dates in British history. Romans leave is normally taken as 410 AD, which again is something that is now wrong. But we're talking about a period of about 650 years, a long time. So inevitably, I'm going to be zooming across things. Bear with me. I'm trying to pick out the things that I found most interesting. But I think it's worthwhile pointing out that we're talking about a period of about 30 generations. So things that were true at one point in time may well be totally different a few generations further down the line. I can't do justice to the whole subject, as I said, but we'll do our best. I'm certainly going to try and bring in some of the more recent research, particularly things like DNA analysis, that I think do rather throw a light on the way we look at it. The reason the Victorians called it the Dark Ages was primarily because there's so few written records from the period, that it wasn't a literate society in the sense of writing things down. Obviously, a lot of things that were written down haven't survived. The people who did write things down were by and large churchmen, and of course they had a very particular perspective on life and view of the world, and very often were writing with a view to expressing a moral story rather than necessarily getting their facts correct. I've listed a few of the key sources there. There are others, but some of them are continental, for example, which might just refer to a churchman coming across the channel and who we met and so on here. The other point is that where some of these records, they're more than one copy, the copies don't necessarily agree with each other. So you might claim that such an author said such and such, but further down the road, there's another copy of his work that says a different date, a different way of looking at things. So I'm afraid you're going to have to bear with me. In this context, I don't think anybody really has the full picture. The picture I'm going to give tonight is essentially my evaluation of it, based obviously on people far more knowledgeable than myself, who in themselves disagree with each other. That however eminent a professor you are, no doubt there is another professor at a different university who totally and utterly disagrees with you. And equally, the evidence is quite often contradictory, particularly when it comes to things like dates. So I will try and be as accurate as I can, but I'm always guarantee that some of the stuff I say tonight, you could go onto the internet and in 5 minutes find a very eminent and learned article that totally disagrees with me. So throughout the talk, I'm going to try and impose words like it seems likely that, or people think that, but I'm going to forget at times. And so just take it as read that pretty much anything I say is going to be along those lines. One other precondition I'm going to put down right now to everybody in the room is that anybody who mentions King Arthur will immediately get ejected. This is not about King Arthur. I'm also at times going to be leaping the boundary from Somerset, insofar as for much of this period our history was very much tied up with Wiltshire, Hampshire and surrounding counties. That Somerset as a political entity didn't exist for much of the period in question.
Didn't move on, Ken, should it have done?
Could do. In terms of a broad timeline, they are the broad 4 sections that I'm going to be covering. They merge into each other. They do at least give some sort of structure to the whole talk. But one thing I'd like to emphasise is that we are talking about here, our county, our village, our part of the world. It isn't some distant place. It is stuff that happened on these fields that just across the road where they're ploughing, the Romans probably ploughed before us. The road that we drive along quite possibly was a drove road or a Roman road before us. It's not distant, it is here. Trying to bring it back to a reality and away from the waffle. I thought we might sort of look first of all at Wansdyke. This very impressive earthwork, obviously heavily eroded in most places, but still very impressive in others, that was perhaps the biggest engineering work of the period we're talking about. And it seems to me that if we can explain why it was built, then we'll go some way towards tying down quite a lot of the history. As I say, it is a very impressive piece of work. It extends essentially east-west across the county into Wiltshire. I hope you can still see that. So it goes nowadays from just south of Bristol right the way through to just south of Marlborough. Obviously, whole sections of it have disappeared, but that was the original route of it. As you saw on the previous slide, it was an earthwork facing north. The ditch was on the north side. So the earth from the ditch was piled up on the south side to form a barrier. From Bath to the east for a section, it was actually just the Roman road that went from Bath to London, which was on the embankment, and that was incorporated into it. So it's an interesting question as to why it was built and so on and so forth, and one that I'd like to sort of lead up to further on. But it is important to realise it isn't a fortification to stop an army. It is a barrier to stop people easily coming to raid cattle, coming to pinch your daughters. It would slow an army down, but it wouldn't stop it. I mean, it would be fairly easy in a day or so to fill in the ditch and drive an army through. It was a barrier. It was a this far and no further sort of situation. Let's go back to where we started the period, to around about 410 and Roman Britain. Now, I hope you can at least see some of this. This is the Somerset as it appeared to the Romans. 3 key towns. You have Cirencester, obviously not politically in Somerset, but the key strategic part of this part of Britain. You have Wells, which we also all know about, and further south we have Ilchester, all joined by the Fosse Way, the main Roman road. Closer to home, clearly there's Charterhouse up on the hill, very much past its peak as a production site for lead and silver. It had been superseded by mines elsewhere in the Roman Empire to a degree, still producing, but by a contractor, not by the imperial authorities. But interestingly, there was, of course, the road that went from Charterhouse all the way to Salisbury, straight as a die, if you believe the modern Ordnance Survey maps. One road that has largely disappeared in terms of physical evidence, but which at the time must have been quite important. And I think, again, it is quite significant that the east-west route disappeared, but in the sense the north-south Roman route is essentially the roads we still drive today in a lot of places. So, Roman Somerset. Essentially, it was divided up into the territories of three civitates, Roman regions, if you like, each based on a pre-existing tribe. The names are there, as are the centres of them. And it's important to realise that in Roman Britain at the time, there were actually very few Italian Romans in the country. That when we talk about Roman Britain, we're essentially talking about Romanised Britons who were occupying the towns, were occupying the cities, and so on and so forth. The borders between the tribes were, broadly speaking, the River Parrett down through Bridgewater and the Mendips. They were governed in Roman terms to the north from actually Winchester, which was a slight anomaly. The Dura Trigum were from Dorchester, and the Dunmonium were from Exeter. And the Dunmonium we will come back to particularly. As I said earlier, the general consensus until relatively recently was that Roman Britain, you could imagine it ending in 410. It's about right, but the Roman legions actually left a couple of years before then. But I would argue that the Roman legions leaving was more of a symptom than a cause of the decline of Roman Britain. The empire in Europe, Western Europe, and including Britain, had been in decline for 50 or so years before that. The troops that were withdrawn, the legions, were actually based on three garrison towns, South Wales and two up by Hadrian's Wall. The day-to-day policing of the coastline, for example, was very much in the hands of auxiliary troops, most of whom were mercenaries, many of them from Germany, were actually Saxons. And when the legions were withdrawn, the people who lived here didn't know that that was potentially the end of Roman Britain. It had happened before. For a couple of years, they would be expecting the legions to return. But of course, we now know with hindsight that they didn't. So what you then got for a considerable period of time was a gradual decline of Roman Britain. It wasn't a sudden event. And the letter, many of you have probably heard of the letter that the centre supposedly wrote to the Britons saying, you've got to defend yourselves, is now thought not to refer to Britain at all. It was actually written to a town in southern Italy. So that's another theory that bites the dust. In terms of Roman Britain, this part of the world, as I say, Cirencester was the key regional capital. That's an artist's impression of what it looked like. You can see the wall around it. Those of you who know Cirencester, the amphitheatre in the top left of the picture, the remains of it are still there. You can see it's not huge, nowhere was. The estimate would be that the entire population of Roman Somerset, as it is now, would be of the order of, let's say, 50,000 people, which is perhaps half the population of Weston-super-Mare today, just to give a context. And what you got was the gradual, as I say, decline of Roman influence. They stopped paying taxes. Why should they pay taxes to Rome when they're not getting any services back? They stopped communicating so much with the centre and very much started governing themselves. The tribes started to fragment back to their original loyalties. The situation was such that a lot of people were starting to take precautions they might not otherwise have done. I mean, Somerset has a lot, about 100 finds of Roman hoards of coins that were buried over the period, something like 350 to 500. So we're obviously talking about unstable times. It's difficult to say precisely why, what the threat was, but it was clearly there. We're talking about agricultural society primarily, as you would expect. This is again an artist's impression of a Roman villa. And during this time, in different parts of Somerset, the Roman villas gradually fell into disrepair. And I mean, the theory now is that they weren't able to get if you like, the spare parts for the heating systems, that the money wasn't there to buy them new roofing tiles, etc., etc., etc. That the elites may well have moved into the towns for security. And what you find in quite a lot of locations is that the nice mosaics that were key to the luxurious living of the elite, you start to find partitions straight across them, that they were being used as storage facilities rather than living. So a gradual decline of Roman influence, a gradual increase, a return to the pre-Roman British loyalties. So this is an example of the sort of coin hoards that have been found, as I say, quite regularly in Somerset. A big one, for example, was found near Chew Magna. They are not uncommon. Another aspect of it was that they reoccupied at least some of the Iron Age forts. This is the hill fort at just outside Cadbury Garden Centre, basically at Coningsbury. As you can see, it was reoccupied a couple of times during this period, right up possibly to the start of the 6th century. Again, it's difficult to say what people felt threatened by, but clearly at times of upheaval, a hill fort like that, uncomfortable though it might be, was a better bet than a nice villa down on the plain and open to attack. One of the events which we can pinpoint from the written record is a battle, quite a famous battle, the Battle of Mons Bagdonicus. I think that's about right, which we think was fought probably at Bragdon, just north of Wootton Bassett near Swindon. And it was recorded as being a massive victory for the Romano-British, led by Ambrosius Aurelianus, a really Roman name, very indicative perhaps that the Roman society was still extant in that part of the world. And it was recorded that it kept the Saxon invaders away for 50 years, that it was such an important victory. But what it meant was that the country was being partitioned, that Somerset was still Romano-British, Celtic, Welsh, whatever you want to call it, whereas to the east, you were getting much more Saxon influence. Now, the society we're talking about, not that different from later situations. We all know about the Black Death in the medieval period, but the bubonic plague did attack Europe frequently much earlier. But there was a key incident of the plague in 541 AD in Europe, which almost certainly came across the Channel, and some commentators believe absolutely reduced the population of this country by a massive amount. Very poorly documented, but as a thesis, I would put forward that if the plague did decimate the country, very often it's at times of plague like that, social change, economic change happens very quickly. And I would put forward the thesis that this was at least a contributing factor to some of the changes that happened subsequently. And of course, at the time, they had no way of treating the plague. It was treated as an act of God, and people died probably in their droves. What it also perhaps allows is the idea that with land being vacated, dare I say it, by the death of the owners, by widows being left, this was a real opportunity for Saxons who were obviously in the country to quite peacefully take over part of the land. If you've got if you were a widow and you've got 3 or 4 children and a farm, and you've got this sort of strapping young Saxon bloke comes along and says, "Hey, do you want to marry me? I'll look after you," then it's perhaps quite hard to say no. But that is pretty speculative. Perhaps a key date, again, is recorded in one of the documents, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, is a battle, which you can read there what it actually says. So we've got the Saxons coming into Gloucestershire, basically, and achieving a real victory over 3 petty kingdoms based on Gloucester, Cirencester, and Bath. And again, it's worthwhile pointing out that all 3 of them, of course, were major Roman centres. This is where I would put forward the hypothesis that Wansdyke comes into the game. Now, it's worth saying that if you read up in the books or go online, some people will say it was built as early as 350 AD, and some people say it was built as late as 700 AD. There is hardly any archaeological evidence as to when it was built. I would go along with people who suggest that it was after that battle that it makes the most sense to build a dyke of the extent of Wansdyke. It was not a trivial thing to build. It was something that took a lot of effort, that it was there for a real purpose. And I think the location is quite indicative. It goes south of Bath, for example. It doesn't follow the river valley. It goes south of Bath. So it's quite a reasonable hypothesis, I think, that was the boundary between the remains of Celtic Britain to the south and the Saxons who had just achieved a resounding victory to the north. Nobody knows. It's a guess. If you come up with a different theory, then it's probably as plausible as anything as I can come up with. But it seems to make sense to me that the timing and the reason is right. I would also suggest that if you remember earlier on, I showed you the tribal breakdown of Somerset in Roman times. The Dunmanonium, who were the tribe from the southwest, by this stage had extended their influence up into Somerset. They're actually quite an interesting group of people. The Romans largely left them alone because they conceded very quickly, they paid their taxes, what's not to like from the Roman point of view. They were a very powerful sub-kingdom throughout the 5th and 6th centuries, based on Exeter. Exeter was their capital. But for example, Tintagel, which has obviously been fairly extensively excavated, was one of their major sites. And the remains there show quite conclusively that they were trading quite extensively as far as Africa and into Europe and even Thracia. The remains found there came from a wide field. So you've got Somerset at this point, largely controlled by them. So they were powerful enough to do this. to build Wansdyke. They were organised enough to do it. They'd clearly got a good motivation to sort of keep the Saxons out. So it seems to me it all fits into place, but I would emphasise there are eminent academics who would vehemently disagree with that. You pay your money, you take your choice. That's another picture of the Wansdyke. Again, it's better preserved in Wiltshire in many places than it is here. If any of you have not been up to Knoll, just south of Hartcliffe, it is well worth doing. You can sort of see a section of Wansdyke that starts off there, and you've got this good remains of an Iron Age hilltop, literally just on the top of the hill, just behind Hartcliffe. It's quite extraordinary juxtaposition. But again, you can see how it goes across the landscape in a pretty straight line. The Damnonia, usually Latin properly, were inevitably defeated by the Saxons. 2 battles listed there and shown on the map. I would suspect that both battles were actually on the boundaries between the Saxons and the Celts. But it was fairly conclusive that after 658, Somerset very quickly became part of the Saxon sphere of influence. As I implied earlier, that may mean less than it sounds. I don't view it as a pitched battle and suddenly it became Saxon. That there was obviously trade, there were obviously landowners, there were marriages, there was infiltration in peaceful ways prior to then, I'm sure. The Saxons went on in 710, they seized Devon, and that there is a picture of the final marker. That it's Deniart stone, and it's at St Clear in Cornwall, and it marks a monument to the last king of them, who died rather in 875. So as a kingdom, it did last a long time, albeit in narrower and narrower boundaries. So Somerset ceases to be Romano British, Celtic, Welsh, whatever you want to say, whatever word you want to use. And we come to the Anglo-Saxon ascendancy. Now again, Anglo-Saxon is a word conjoined word that has been very much open to misinterpretation. That in reality, we're talking about a number of different tribes, all obviously from the coastline of Europe, but over time have got lumped together and just called Anglo-Saxons. So the Saxons themselves were Germano-Dutch. The Angles came from southern Denmark, and the Jutes, who were also involved, but didn't leave much in the way of naming, were more from northern Denmark. So again, it wasn't a simple situation. None of the Dark Ages ever were. So Saxons, what do we mean by Saxon? And quite simply, it is the people who used a short sword or long knife, pictured there on the left, owner of a seax. And that was what other people called them because of their use of the knife. Just as a total aside, both Middlesex and Essex have crests, coat of arms, with supposedly a seax on them, and that's Essex's one there. Nothing like, they've got it totally, the Victorians got it totally utterly wrong. Nothing whatsoever to do with the real thing. But there you go. So, Somerset place names indicate largely who was the top dog at the time, who settled where. The vast majority of place names in Somerset are ultimately of Anglo-Saxon origin. They're Old English. Not all of them, and you get some compromise ones. You've got some that are mixes, and you've got some which are still Celtic. So, for example, Coombe is Celtic, Welsh. So Blagdon Coombe is a mixture of Saxon and Celtic. Priddy up on top is again Celtic, that presumably probably the Saxons weren't that interested in the relatively poor agricultural land up there. Who knows? That's their flag, the modern flag of Somerset, which, as you can see, is very closely derived from the flag normally associated with Wessex. Again, you've got the dragon symbol in yellow and red. So we were part of the West Saxons, Wessex. And it is one of the big controversies in academic circles for people who cover this period as to how that transition occurred. As I've indicated, it seemed to happen pretty quickly, superficially. That over 100 years or so, this part of the world ceased to be Celtic and became Saxon. Various theories, I don't want to go into the detail, otherwise we'll be here all night. But broadly speaking, you don't even have to pick just one theory. They can be a mixture. They can all have some benefit to them. I think it's almost certain that there was elite replacement, that the lords, the high ups, got replaced. If nothing else, it was a grave dishonour to be defeated in battle. And certainly among the nobility, there was a very high death rate because, quite simply, if you were captured, there was the humiliation of capture, but then you would end up a slave. And if you were top dog, you really didn't want that to happen. So I think there's quite a lot of elite replacement. There's the idea that you had different settlements for different groups of people, the apartheid model, which I think is, some place names suggest that, but it's a hard one to push too far. The gradual integration, which I think is the much more fashioned in academic circles now, and which I've tended to espouse in the talk so far, that the idea that over generations, and you are talking in generations, the Saxons gradually took over land, gradually integrated, gradually became more important. And ethnogenesis, I have to say, is a theory I don't even really understand, but it is basically on the idea that you came up with a combined culture, a set of myths, a set of ideas that the two cultures brought together and combined. You can take your choice. I've got a bit more to say later on it, but it is quite remarkable, whichever way you look at it, how quickly Old English, which led on to our language, the Saxons, supplanted Celtic as the main language, and how the place names and so on changed. It is perhaps worthwhile saying that probably, and again it's difficult to say, people back then were far more used to speaking more than one language than perhaps we are. That if you go back to Roman times, that you'd have your tribal language, you'd have, if you were going to have dealings with the authority, you probably needed a smattering of Latin, and so on and so forth. If you were going to trade, then you again need languages other than your own. So I suspect there was far more openness to learning a language than perhaps we might have. It's, again, as a total aside, it's interesting that the Saxons, in a relatively short period of time, essentially imposed their language on this part of the world. whereas the Normans, when they arrived a few centuries later, ultimately they ended up speaking English, not us speaking French. Again, an interesting area of inquiry. Now, as I indicated, modern research has rather thrown new light on a lot of the theories that ultimately stem from the Victorian period. And modern DNA analysis is, and I find it absolutely fascinating on this one. In 2015, there was a big research project conducted by Oxford University in conjunction with the Wellcome Foundation. And what they basically did was to find a sample of people in England and actually the whole Great Britain who could trace via their grandparents back to a particular part of the country. That it looked as though their antecedents had not moved for generations. And again, I think we could all highlight families in Blagdon who might well fit that criteria. They took a sample of DNA and ultimately put these people into 14 categories based on the basis of their DNA solely. They then plotted, and only at that point did they do it, they then plotted that DNA onto a map. And this is what they found. The key finding probably, which is the lightish blue, is that the vast majority of the DNA of people in this country is Celtic, is Welsh, no difference. There is an overlay of Saxon, but it is only an overlay. That most of the DNA in England is still from the original peoples who moved into the country about 9,000 years ago across the land bridge from Europe. The light blue, as I say, is the areas which are most Celtic. The red areas where Celtic is still predominating the DNA, but the red is where there is more Saxon. It is worthwhile pointing out that, except in very specific parts of the country, the Vikings and the Normans and the Romans had negligible impact on the DNA of the country. Now, I'm sorry about the slide's a bit fuzzy, but I think you can probably catch it. This is a close-up of the southern part of England. And I think what you can see is that Somerset is pretty firmly light blue. South of us, down into Hampshire, Dorset, a lot more red, where the Saxons spent a lot longer radial along the coast, much longer not integrating. And north, up in Gloucestershire, more red. And with a bit of imagination, I would put forward the hypothesis that the divide is not that far off Wansdyke. That we are seeing perhaps the divide that took place 1,500 or so years ago. Again, quite interesting that Cornwall and Devon are different to a degree. And again, as I pointed out earlier on, they were about the last part of the country to succumb to the Saxons. But I would emphasise that the modern research suggests that there was not displacement, that the Victorians and so on thought that the Saxons came in, drove the Celts out, they ended up in Wales and Cornwall. That is not what happened. This proves it. The Celts stayed. And when you think about it, it makes total sense that the number of Saxons coming across, invading, was always relatively small in total numbers compared with the native population. Yes, they were ultimately victorious. They were the ones at the top of the tree. But in terms of imposing their DNA on the population, not so much. And I do think it's quite interesting that Somerset does appear, despite later history, to be particularly Celtic rather than Saxon. We don't want to push it too far in terms of analysis. I think it's more a question of disproving theories rather than proving them. But I actually find it totally fascinating that modern research so conclusively shows that what previous generations have thought is wrong. And if you think about it, in modern human terms, you've got this group of, let's say, 20-year-old Saxon warriors come across, all gung-ho, got their swords, got their shields and so on, take over. They, left to their own devices, aren't going to want to be the guys out in the rain ploughing the fields. They are the ones who want to be top dogs, having a feast and so on and so forth. And that, I think, is perhaps more the way to look at it. And again, I draw an analogy. If you think of the Brits in India, in the British Empire, about 100,000 Britons ruled a country with a population of 250 million or so, imposed their language so that even today, if you want to get on as an educated Indian, you have to speak English. It happens that relatively small numbers can impose a quite big change on a much bigger population. My theory, anyway. So the Saxons, as I say, came over, believe it or not, by boat. And it's quite interesting that in a comprehensive list of laws that was drawn up in about 690, that sort of period, in Wessex, which obviously is where we are now, the laws applied differently to the Welsh, which is what the Saxons called the Celts, i.e. foreigner. Welsh equals foreigner in Old English. The laws were different for them. So that, for example, in a court of law, the word of a Welshman counted far less than a Saxon. If you killed a Saxon, the price you had to pay the family was much higher than if you killed a Welshman, and so it goes. Inevitably, life being life as it is, slaves had very few rights at all. And throughout this period, right away from the Romans, right the way through, slavery was a fact of life. It was a basis of the bottom tier of society. The number of slaves varied, but mostly would appear to have been around about the 15 to 25% of the population mark. So it was never a majority, but it was never significant. Slaves, depending on the period, captives from warfare, but quite often you actually got, in times of poor harvest or whatever, people actually sold their children into slavery because that way they would at least be fed and clothed and wouldn't die of starvation. And sometimes you actually found people selling themselves into slavery. Interestingly, this set of laws in the 690s, Devon, which as I've pointed out was already in the Saxon sphere of influence, was excluded. So again, the idea was that different laws apply to different people. Another interesting twist, this same king, King Ine, I-N-E, in 726 imposed a tax, Peter's pence, familiar name, but it was to support an English college in Rome. And again, I think this shows that although we tend to think of the Saxon period and so on as in isolation, there were these links across to the continent, that we were part of the European model, that things were happening. And that is very much echoed by the guy I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about, Alfred the Great. He's the only king in English history called the Great, and by gosh, he deserves the title in my view. He really does. We've jumped about 100 years, so please do bear with me with that. But his influence was in many fields, and again, a whole topic in his own right. But this statue, I think, typifies it. In one hand, he's got a war axe, and in the other hand, he's got a scroll. That he was important both in the warfare field, but also in terms of civil society, in law giving, in learning, in the church, and so on and so forth. And just as important as himself is his family. It actually blows me away that he was actually the youngest son. There was never any chance of him becoming king for many years, but his elder brothers all died, so he did. His two children, Ethelfled and Edward, she married the king of Mercia, the Saxon kingdom to the north of us. When he died, she took over. Now, let me just stop there. This is a woman running a Saxon kingdom. The Saxons did not have a word for queen, so they had to call it Lady of the Mercians. She and her brother Edward, who inherited Wessex, between them, pretty well conquered the rest of the country and created largely a unified England. And Edward's son Athelstan is normally taken to be the first king of England. In the history books, he is down as the first king of all England. So his territory extended right up into Northumberland, across to Kent, and so on and so forth. An extraordinary dynasty. Blows me away. Ethelfled, of all the women in English history, she is the one I would most like to meet. She is wow. What she achieved as a woman in that period is just unbelievable. Anyway, that's beyond my remit at the moment. Alfred, back to Alfred. We're now starting to talk about Viking invasions, another wave of invaders coming across from the continent. As King of Wessex, he was king of the last kingdom in England not to succumb to the Vikings. They swept all before them except for Wessex. Wessex survived, but only just. For many years, they were not successful in battle. They were paying Dame Geld to the Vikings, and things were not going well. What we've got, though, is in 877, Arthur was passing Christmas at Chippenham, which was one of his fortified royal estates. The Vikings were overwintering at Gloucester, and on 12th night, they launched a surprise raid on Chippenham. Alfred escaped by the skin of his teeth. I mean, it really was over the walls, run away with half a dozen people. So he then went down into South Somerset to, Atherley, down there in what was then the Somerset Levels, very marshy, pretty well impassable in winter. He burnt the cakes. Let's get it out of the way. That's when he burnt the cakes. which he probably did actually, because it was one of those things he himself related to his biographer many, many years later. And I don't think it's the sort of thing you'd make up, is it? You know, sort of hiding out down in the marshes and, you know, anyway. He somehow, and this is a great feat of organisation, from his hideaway down there, he was able to get the men of Hampshire, Somerset and Dorset together without the Vikings really knowing about it, and fought a battle against them there at Edington. Now, this is probably one of the most important battles in English history. Probably, and this is my interpretation, it probably wasn't a glorious battle. And my suspicion is that the Vikings, who tried to avoid pitched battles, they didn't like pitched battles. They were after booty, they were after cattle, they were hit and run merchants. I reckon fairly ingloriously, Alfred probably ambushed them while they were out on a raid. But whatever, it was a resounding victory for the locals. The Vikings were forced back to Chippenham, and there they were besieged. Now, again, this is fairly unprecedented, because up until then, the Saxons hadn't been very good at besieging things. This time they stuck with it. And after a couple of weeks, the Vikings were forced to surrender. And the king then went with Alfred down to Allah, down here, where he was forcibly almost converted to Christianity. They then went on to Wedmore, just down the road from here, where the Treaty of Wedmore was signed, and that very much was the turning point for the Viking invasion of this country. If it hadn't been for these events, we would be Viking. It didn't drive them out, but it stopped them expanding. It made sure that Wessex survived. And that was absolutely key to the future development of England as we know it. The Vikings were basically told to get lost. They retreated up to Cirencester, overwintered at Cirencester, and then eventually went back to East Anglia. The divide, you had the Danes basically the other side of Watling Street, to a north-south route. But the key thing was that Wessex survived. That's just a stone that marks the supposed site of the battle. Nobody really quite knows where it was fought, but it was up on the hills above the village. Now again, Alfred was a great administrator, a great thinker, a great organizer, in a way that hadn't been seen before. And what he did to consolidate his victory was to set up a whole series of burghs all over Wessex. The idea being that if the Vikings raided again, then everybody was within about a day's march of a fortified place. So the Vikings couldn't take over the country in the way that they had done with the hit and run raids. And this was very successful. This was the end of successful Viking raiding over Wessex. One of them you might be able to see is actually Southwark. So this was the re-establishment of London after it had largely been abandoned in previous generations. So he was important there. He was important in terms of setting up learning. He encouraged literacy. He encouraged the church. And as I said, his children and grandson were absolutely critical in terms of setting up England as we know it. absolutely critical. You're probably familiar with this item of jewellery called the Alfreds Jewel. It's an istel, which is a pointer, and at the bottom you've got you would have had probably a wooden pointer, and this was the head of it. Beautiful piece of art that was found in a field in North Petherton, and is thought to be a gift from Alfred, rather, sorry, to track there, to the monastery at Atherley, which he established after he'd overwintered there. And round the edge of it, it does actually say, Alfred ordered me to be made. So this is a direct link, a very rare direct link to probably the greatest king in English history. Anglo-Saxon social organisation, which would have applied totally to Somerset, to our part of the world, is very hierarchical. We think we live in a hierarchical world, but there it really was, the world you were born into was probably the world you died into. Simplified list there of the ranks from top to bottom. It is simplified. There were more subcategories than that, but it gives you an idea that the world was as it was. The number of top rank, which are the people we tend to think of, they're the people who appear in the sagas, the people who own the expensive swords, the people who did all the drinking and the hoards and so on. Relatively few in number. I mean, 90% of the population probably worked on the land. The number of elite, very few indeed, and indeed the number of elite craftsmen to support them, again, not that great. So you've got at the top picture, obviously, is the lords and ladies with their weapons, and of course, being allowed to carry a sword was a distinct mark of respect. And at the bottom, you've got probably slaves under the direction of a foreman there, cutting the corn in the fields. A very hierarchical situation. In terms of geography, Somerset was divided up like so. The basic unit was a hide. You've probably heard this term. And a hide was enough land supposedly to support one family. So although it averaged about 120 acres, it varied hugely across the country. So if you were up, say, up on Mendip, you'd need a lot more land to support a family than if you were down in the river valley, down on the River Yeo, on the fertile land down there. We were then divided up into hundreds, of which at the time was approximately 100 hides. It was literally 100. And about 40 of those made up Somerset. So there were 40 or so hundreds in Somerset Shire. Slightly outside that hierarchy, you'd have the manor house, perhaps with a church, perhaps not, depending whether the lord of the manor wanted to have a church. There would be villages, which would be groups of houses, but again, largely for the agricultural workers. And there were a few towns that were fortified, but would have the tradespeople and merchants, but they were very much a minority. So that's a map of the Winterstoke Hundred that we were in. As you probably know, it lasted centuries as a concept, as a name. As I said, it constituted, when set up, approximately 100 hides. And the centre for us was Banwell. Banwell was the centre of our 100. Which leads to the question, why on earth is it called the Winterstoke Hundred? And it is thought that there was a village, a small village called Winterstoke just outside Banwell, which has since disappeared, which gave its name to the 100, and which lasted, obviously, for centuries thereafter. Saxon buildings were pretty basic. They didn't, by and large, reoccupy stone buildings from the Roman era. Their tradition from Scandinavia and Germany was to build in wood, and quite simply, their society didn't necessarily have extensive skills in stone building, although there were some. But interestingly, they had a tendency, rather than repair buildings, obviously wooden buildings have a finite life, they would tend to be a bit like the Americans are today. Once a building gets towards the end of its life, instead of mending it, you abandon it and move on. So over time, a number of Saxon villages have actually moved quite long distances as the site was moved. Any village of a decent size would have a hall, which would be the centre of the social life and where the feasting and so on and so forth took place. Very much a communal type of society, that within your 100, you were very much responsible for other people. That if one member of the 100 committed a murder, then unless you delivered him up to justice, then the whole 100 could be punished. You did get, to some degree, some stone churches. Industry was there, fairly small scale. So, for example, probably the mining up on Mendip would have been very limited. And there's some evidence that there was a certain amount of iron working during this period, but it is very limited. So you've got blacksmithery, obviously. You had weaving. Textiles obviously necessary for clothing. But what fabric you wore was very much a mark of status. You know, the high classes wore a certain fabric, the lower classes tatty stuff. But the artwork from this period is absolutely stunning. Any of you who've seen the Sutton Hoo hoard, it's absolutely mind-blowing, the quality of the workmanship. Very much for the elite, obviously, very much few craftsmen producing it, but as intricate work, and this is just a belt buckle magnified. I mean, you can see the intricacy of the work, and I mean, that is perhaps 3 times actual size. I mean, absolutely incredible. And, you know, we couldn't surpass it today. We're actually using the same sort of tools for handmade jewellery, using the same techniques as today. And of course, again, from Sutton Hoo, the very famous helmet, currently in the British Museum. But again, as a piece of workmanship, and artwork, absolutely extraordinary, brilliant. So you've got this almost conflict. You've got the sort of the aesthetic susceptibility, the delight in art and workmanship, but quite often used to produce superb helmets like that, which I'm sure you'd never go into battle wearing something that valuable, but you had the warlike tendency. Religion I've not really talked about much along the way. Roman times, of course, the state religion towards the end of the period was Christianity. Even during the Roman period, various other religions held sway in the country, no problems there. Revert to paganism, Christianity gradually taking over. And I say gradual because it depended very much on the whims, the religious beliefs of the king. And some kings did actually switch religions halfway through their reign. Some Christian kings paid sons, so a more complicated picture than you might think. But broadly speaking, Christianity spread from minsters, from endowments, this top-down religion. So this picture is actually the remains of an old minster in the grounds of Gloucester Cathedral from the period. That's Rathline Church, which again is a high status quality building from the time. Tall, very narrow, very few windows, very typical of a Saxon church in terms of overall design. But in terms of quality, that's probably more typical of the sort of thing that might have been built in Blagdon if there was a Saxon church here. We know there was a Norman church, but whether there was a Saxon one before then is open to question. You can quite simply see that as being a barn, can't you? It's not in any way ecclesiastical in its design. As I've said, the Saxons, as pretty well all societies until fairly recently, the vast bulk of the population earn their living off the land. Compared with the Romans, the Britons and Saxons probably depended more on animal husbandry and less on the growing of crops. That was partly due to climate change. It suggested that the climate got milder and wetter over the period. But equally, if you take my thesis that bubonic plague and so on did reduce the population, again, obviously arable farming is much more labour intensive than the rearing of animals. Another byproduct of that is the field structure, that very often you had a plough like that pulled by up to 8 oxen. Now, if you can imagine how long a team of 8 oxen, even in pairs with a plough behind it, you're talking quite a length. Now, turning an outfit like that, any of you have driven a tractor, even today, sort of turning at the end of your plough line, your furrow. So Saxon fields tended to be longer and narrower than their Roman equivalents. That you obviously wanted a great long run ploughing with a plough like that than otherwise. But as I say, animal husbandry was very much more important than it had been. Less labour intensive, less demanding. Perhaps, as I said, one of the key things that we owe the Saxons is our language. And just as a bit of intro, I don't think you can read it at the back, but I put down there 7 languages, all saying the same thing. I'm speaking to you in English. The first 4 are sort of Germanic languages, and you can sort of see the similarities between them. The 5th, those of you who remember your holidays or your schoolboy French, is French. I'm hoping the 6th one, Chris, please tell me if I'm right, because I got it off Google Translate, is Welsh, I hope. If it's wrong, I apologise. Blame Google Translate.
That's pretty good.
Is it? Okay, thank you. And the 7th is Latin, and at which point I wish to put in a quick commendation to my old Latin master, Bert Scotcher, who, if he saw me today, would be, I hope, proud of that translation. But again, I'm not totally essential, right? No, the point I'm trying to make is that the language that we speak is very much, you can see the similarities to the Germanic languages and the differences from the other ones. And it's just an interesting point that the 7 words at the top are all Old English in origin. They're all Saxon. So, we were part of Wessex. What did Wessex do for Somerset? Well, one interesting aspect is that under Alfred, the county system that we know to this day was when it was first set up. And Somerset, along with Hampshire and Wiltshire and Dorset, are among the oldest local authorities in the world not just in this country, in the world, to still be running. He set up the system of local government, essentially as we know it today. The language, but much more is that, probably our way of thinking about things. This whole idea that he and his family created England in many respects. Later on, beyond the period I'm covering really, we actually had a Viking king, King Canute, but he was very definitely king of the entire country. And when he died and things broke up, it still broke up as an entire country. It wasn't subdividing up again into individual kingdoms. So I think it's fair to say that Somerset and the surrounding country, Wiltshire in particular, in a way, we were the centre, the origin of England as we know it. And of course, this part of the world, pretty well middle of that. So thank you very much for listening. Hope it wasn't went on too long after the kerfuffle at the start. If anybody's got any questions, I will do my best to
Let me see if I can bring the audience
we'll
in.
now sort of try and link in with Zoom.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Take that away, Ken. At the beginning, I couldn't get rid of seeing all the people. Let's see if we can now get them back.
Please.
Ah, here we are.
Be polite.
There they are, look.
Yeah.
All of them.
Well, still there. Well, Sarah has to be, so.
Let's see if I can open that up a bit. Right. If you'd like to unmute yours, I unmute you all. Hang on. No, I can't. You need to unmute yourselves. If anybody wants to ask a question, raise your hand and I will unmute you. If you can't unmute yourselves.
For that matter, if you're in the room, you just.
Yes. If you're in the room, I will probably. If you're in the room, I will repeat your question so that the people remote can actually.
I think for those remote people, if you press the space bar, I think that should unmute you.
Hold it down while you talk.
Hold it down, is it? Okay.
By the way, any questions in the room?
You were saying that Devon and Cornwall were Saxons under central Somerset.
Yeah.
Elements of Somerset. So what were their origins?
The question was Devon, Cornwall, different ethnic origins. The similarities are bigger than the differences, that they are still predominantly, as you would expect, Celtic. I'm definitely trying to remember what else there was there. The simple answer is I don't know, I can't remember. If you are interested, if you go online, you can find the Oxford research from 2015. And they may well show, as I say, they did 14 different categories.
Was there a French link at that time, or is it too soon for that?
Too soon. The Normans were obviously later, but they left remarkably little DNA behind them.
I'm just thinking of Brittany, the link with Cornwall,
Yeah.
language,
Yeah.
Celtic language.
Yes. I mean, the key thing from the research was that over the rest of England, we very much underestimated the Celtic genes, that they are still underpinning most of us. There was some evidence in, you remember I was talking about a period when the Saxons were taking over Somerset. There was some evidence that at that time, some of the elite did actually emigrate to Brittany, out into Wales, but you are talking about relatively small numbers of people who basically could afford to do so. That the vast majority of the population, obviously, instead of having a Celtic boss, had a Saxon boss and got on with it. So yes, it's a fascinating area. It's very complicated. and you could perhaps criticise their methodology in terms of sample size and so on. But it certainly highlights, dare I say it, the outcome of many bits of academic research. More could be done. Yes.
You talk very interestingly about the way that language change came to what we call England on the back of what, from DNA and common sense, we know was a relatively proportionately small invading force of Germanic people. Of course, these invaders weren't on their own. Their counterparts going into Gaul, going to Hispania, going to northern Italy, and so on. In those cases, they pick up the local language. They don't impose a Germanic language in France or in Spain, Portugal, Italy. Why? What's peculiar about conditions in England where these people get out of their boats and are successful in relatively small numbers, persuading this large population of Celtic speakers with sophisticated language and culture going back millennia, all to start speaking English? It's an anomaly, isn't it?
Yeah. The question is why relatively few Saxons come in were able to impose their language on a much bigger and sophisticated Celtic population. And the answer is it's one of the big questions in academic circles that greater men than I have spent their entire lives trying to answer. And I find it fascinating. I think for me, and this is a personal view based on my reading, is that the Celts were probably more multilingual than we give them credit for. So there was some propensity to learn other languages, and probably they had a smattering of people who spoke Saxon as a second language even before. But I agree. I mean, I think I alluded that the Normans, when they came, which is perhaps an analogous situation, the Normans ended up speaking English. I mean, it may have taken a couple of centuries, but they did. Whereas the Saxons in 100 years or so seem to have so totally taken over with what we now call Old English. I think possibly it was, I mean, what we've got is a bastardized version of the Germanic languages. So we've dropped, a lot of the complexities, the genders, for example, an obvious one. Whether Saxon just worked better, I honestly don't know. But I mean, all of the common words, certainly nouns and so on, that we use today, the vast majority of them are Saxon. Huge overlays from later French words in terms of cooking and court life, and the Latin, obviously a lot of words from the law and the church and so on. So there are a lot of other influences. If I could answer that one, I would be absolutely delighted. I would, preen myself and award myself a PhD, I think. But it's a question that absolutely fascinates me. I agree with you. But sorry to disappoint. Have you any thoughts on the matter?
Yeah, probably. Well, I think isn't the difference that probably Latin was not as widely spoken in England as it was in, say, northern Italy, obviously, and in Gaul, places that were probably more penetrated by Latin. And if Latin was the language that arriving Germanic speakers were encountering,
No.
Latin was more of a prestigious language.
No. Latin pretty well died out by then. I was in a church, probably.
Yeah, French is descended from Latin, so that and Spanish and Italian as well. So there's been a lot of Latin speaking in the late Roman period in those cycles.
Yeah, fair point. Any other questions?
Can I ask one? If you can hear me. Just early on, you were talking about the Charterhouse area peaking for lead and silver quite a long time before the Roman period ended. Is there much archaeological evidence of what then happened in small scale mining through the next 300 or 400 years?
I'm not an expert on it, and I think probably that, anyone who could correct me, that any activity at that stage has probably been lost to later activity. Obviously, the area's been mined on and off for 2,000 years, and I think the relatively small scale that there might have been has probably been overtaken by subsequent workings, to my knowledge. I mean, there is evidence of, as I think I mentioned, of some small-scale iron workings, but that's the only one I'm aware of from this period.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, if there's anyone out there Zooming who wants to email in a question, I'm sure